So what did we discuss? Nobody remembers. सुबह हमने क्या किया? Was the poetry session so traumatic that you are silenced? You are tired. क्या है? Yeah, मानसिक. Jeta.
I do remember slightly. I'll try as much as I can.
Yeah.
So we, Jelta raised upon the question of author and authorial interpretation, through which we then talked on William K. Vincent Jr. and Monroe C. Birdsclay and their essay, The Intentional Fallacy, where they say that the intentions or consciousness of an artist are not required, or most of the time they are not available while one is interpreting a poem. So when they say that when a work is written, it becomes a public property. So the private part of the author and its subjectivity is not required for interpretation of the art. You gave us an example which was a part of the essay, though Habib doesn't mention it, where if one goes to a restaurant and you place an order for a pudding, we do not, for judging the taste or the quality of the pudding, we do not require to know the cook's mental or emotional state. What is required is the knowledge of taste itself. Then fallacy means illogical or incorrect logic. Uh, there was also an example from John Donne's valediction forbidding mourning, where uh, he has imagery and symbols of astronomy in his poetry, which one could assume by our prior knowledge of Donne. As he was fond of astronomy, we could assume that is the reason for him to invoke these imagery, but that's merely an assumption, and it could be altogether and completely different reason for him to use astronomy in his poem. Also, notes which are underneath Eliot's poem, Wasteland, are to be read as a part of the poem itself. They do not tell us anything extra about the poem, and they do not help in interpreting the poem. This essay somewhere also anticipates structuralist and post-structuralist ideas of depth of the author, which I didn't completely understand, but yes. Uh, so a printed public text becomes a public property, and so one cannot judge it based on personal biographical context of the author. So then again, the whole question of authorship comes under question here. Then we moved towards discussing their other essay, The Affective Fallacy, which was written in 1960. Fallacy, okay, fallacy. The Affective Fallacy, which was written in 1949, where they said your emotional response cannot become a critical statement. So, in order for one to make a critical judgment, we need to keep our emotional responses aside. So, the business of literary criticism is disinterested, an idea very similar to Kant and others. Then we talked about Stanley Fish, who was a reader response theory critic and who was in oppose of this whole idea of considering text as an object. This idea of considering text as an object, which was the idea of the new critics, was under attack by the reader response theory critics and also the post structuralists. New critics were in a way also trying to bring in an intensive reading method of text rather than just arbitrary interpretations. Yes, also the new critics put an emphasis on the language of the poetry itself. All these ideas of new critics must be understood in context to the whole classroom pedagogy and the task of teaching, which again is an important idea in new critics, the formation of classroom canons. Yes, that's all I remember.
Very, very good. So you didn't understand about structural and post-structural critics. Then it's part of structuralism and post-structuralism. Though I have intended that we made that it may be left for your post-graduation. Yes, a post-wali terms have a post-graduation merit test. That's what I had thought of. But if you are keen to and interested in all these ideas, then we can have sessions on that. So I leave that to you, right?
Yes, once we're done with the syllabus, right?
So I leave, yeah.
Yes, okay.
Once we're done with these things, we can discuss structuralism and post-structuralism in a nutshell. Yeah, very good. Anyone else? Any doubt, query?
Sir, am I audible?
Yeah.
I also didn't understand actually the this post-structuralism thing, but just to little clarify about it, that is it a book written about the death of a particular author, or is it generally about death?
Idea of author, death of the and this concept of author by Roland Barthes, right? Death of the author. Roland, R-O-L-A-N-D. Barthes, B-A-R-T-H-E-S. And What is an Author by Michel Foucault. Right? Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault. So you didn't understand because you have not studied structuralism and post-structuralism. That's why. Okay. Anything else that you would like to ask about new criticism? So what they are trying to say in the second essay is that while intentional fallacy is a kind of equivalent to original logical fallacy, means the search for origin as giving you telling you some information about the constitution of the object. Means if you want to know what is a car, then you have to go back into the origins of the idea of car. That is what is known as original logical fallacy. Affective fallacy, according to them, is consequentialist idea of philosophy. Consequentialist idea is usually found in ethics, which says that how to determine good or bad action is by looking at what is the consequence of that. Right, but when it is transferred to literature, the consequence of a poem is your experience and emotions that poem throws up, right? And it would be something like, in order to understand car, you have to describe your experience of driving in the car, right? So if you describe your experience of driving in the car, it does not help us to understand the structure and the make of that car. So the emotional response is a consequence of that poem. So that won't help us to understand the text. That is what they are arguing, right? So these are some of the ideas, key ideas of new criticism, along with the ideas of paradox and irony and connotation, denotation, imagery, symbolism, and so on, texture. All these ideas are associated with new criticism as they describe the language, the words on the page, right? Okay. So if you don't have any questions, then we'll turn over a leaf and start a new conversation. Shall we? Na. Why are you so stunned? Was that so emotional
Yes,
last session regarding poetry? वो लास्ट सफर जैसा इमोशनल हो गया था क्या? What has happened? No. So no, you are not responding. That's why I thought that last session was like. हाँ, ऑफलाइन होता तो वो वाली फीलिंग आती, लास्ट सफर वाली. अच्छा, for Asma it was last supper. Okay, so shall we change the topic? Now looking at the whole, we are, remember, discussing history of criticism and not criticism per se. So historically speaking, new criticism, Cambridge School, T.S. Eliot and others are prominently in the first half of 20th century. Yeah, so Jay was in an awe. So are you out of that awe? Awe में से आप बाहर आ गए?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. So these are up to, say for example 1920 से लेके 1950 या 60 तक के डेवलपमेंट्स हैं. Too literal out of that awe. What is too literal, Saloni? Out of that awe.
I don't know. It felt as if when you asked that, are you out of that awe now? It felt as if he was inside something. I don't know. It sounded funny to me.
He was awestruck.
Yes.
So if he is back to normal, then we can start. So we looked at a period, specific period of literary history from 1920 to 1960, and that too in Britain and America, right? And very often when we think of Western knowledge traditions or philosophical traditions, we make a distinction between continental philosophies and Anglo-Saxon philosophies. By Anglo-Saxon, you mean American British, the English-speaking philosophies. And if you just look at the history of philosophy in Britain and America and compare it to philosophy in Germany and France, then you can make out what we mean by continental philosophy. By continental philosophy, we mean philosophy of Europe, but primarily of Germany, France, and Italy, for that matter. Primarily these. And Anglo-Saxon would mean American and British. So British tradition, if you look at Francis Bacon, John Locke, David Hume, and then other philosophers, then there is a tendency to be pragmatic, utilitarian, empirical, something to rely on only those questions which are empirically verifiable, rather than enter into the debates around what is the absolute in Hegel or what is transcendental idealism in Kant. All right. So there is a tendency in European thought to dwell upon huge ideas, very often very abstract philosophical ideas. So Kant and Hegel are good examples of European or continental ideas, right? And new criticism that we studied, and I.A. Richards and T.S. Eliot would come closer to the Anglo-Saxon traditions of pragmatic thought. Means if you can't verify, if things cannot be observed, then such large questions are of not of great consequence. And that's why American and British philosophy developed on the lines of analytic philosophy, while continental philosophy developed on the lines of developing very large abstract systems and large notions, right, which could not be justified by or proved by making claims. So Hegel's idea of the absolute is very difficult to prove, right, empirically or whatever. So these are the two orientations of philosophy in the West that we just need to keep in mind. The distinction is in some way, what should I say, simplistic, but then it tells you a great deal about how Western thought itself is not homogeneous. There are various strands and various traditions in Western thought. So when we think about Western civilization and culture, we tend to think of it as a homogeneous phenomena, which it is not, right? So that is what we need to keep in mind. So after discussing Kant, Hegel, Coleridge, and Coleridge was influenced by German idealism substantially, we turn to people like Matthew Arnold, who wanted to bring back focus on disinterested study of literature, and again a kind of Kantian idea, right? So let's go back to Germany, right, and catch up with what has happened over there. And after Hegel, there was a sharp critique of Hegelianism, one coming from people like Arthur Schopenhauer, who seems to attack Kantian and Hegelian philosophy and put the idea of unconscious or will at the center of his philosophy, which later influenced people like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. I'm sorry, Nietzsche and Freud. Other critique came from certain materialist undertaking, kind of reversing the whole project of Hegelianism, right? The followers of Hegel were called young Hegelians, and there were various kinds of groups in Europe in 1840s, right? And they were radical revolutionary groups influenced by Hegel. And one such person was Karl Marx, who participated in worker struggles. But after the revolution of 1848, he had to run away as an exile to Britain, where he stayed. So Marx comes to London, England, and that is where he writes some of his most seminal treatises. And Marx thought has deeply influenced Western world history. That's what I should say. In fact, one of the aspects of Hitler was his hatred for communism and Marxism. right, as Jewish philosophies. So he combined anti-Semitism with anti-communism. And another thing that influenced 20th century was Russian Revolution in 1917, and that was influenced by followers of Marx, like Lenin, Trotsky, and many others. These were the revolutionaries, and they brought about Russian Revolution, where the existing monarchy, which was Tsar monarchy, was killed off, and the bourgeoisie and the proletariat captured power, right, under the leadership of Lenin. And it is a kind of conscious effort to replicate French Revolution, right, that Lenin and Trotsky do, but their basis lies in Marxism. Another very powerful influence of Marx can be found in Chinese Revolution of 1948 or 49, where Mao Zedong, one of the great leaders of Chinese Revolution, brings about a kind of communist rule in China, establishes Communist Party, a single party rule in China, killing off the monarchs and the aristocrats, establishing people's rule, as they say in Russia and China. So these two great events of 20th century show the influence of Marx. After 1945, World War II, Hitler is defeated. World was divided into two parties: those who supported Marxisms of various kinds, and those who supported capitalism of American kind. And this conflict is called the Cold War, right? And India, under Nehru, strategically situated in between. He called it non-allied movement, where he gathered people who did not want to follow either of these systems, communism or capitalism, right? Some form of socialism that Nehru thought of, right? So you can see how yeah.
Could you please repeat that? I did not get. The world was divided into two parties. One supported Marxism and the other supported
Capitalism of,
okay.
of American variety. Those were the NATO countries, the allied countries who had fought against Hitler, the axis of evil, as it was called. So these NATO countries like Britain, like France, like America, all these countries were capitalist countries, while the Soviet Union in China and others are the communist countries, right? So there was this Cold War between both the factions, trying to win over people through their propaganda. So propaganda became primary tool for capturing minds, right? So media was used extensively. All sorts of methods were used by Americans as well as Soviets to propagate their ideology. They would distribute free books in India and so on and so forth, right? Nehru wanted to distance himself from both. And Nehru had a leaning towards Soviet because he was a socialist, right? He did not accept capitalist model completely in toto. So the reason why we should understand Marxism is because it has influenced 20th century deeply, right? After the collapse of Soviet Union in 1989 or 90, and China turning into a kind of capitalist country, right? Though it maintained this one party, it's called Communist Party of China. And it rules over China in a very authoritarian and dictatorial way. It calls itself communist, but it's far, far more capitalist than India, right? So after 1990, Marxism as a political, in geopolitical arena became redundant. It existed then in forms of academics and so on and so forth, right? So the whole century is almost covered by Marxism and its war with capitalism. So what we are going to discuss about Marx is a key to understand your past. Maybe all of you were born after 1995 or mid 1990s, right? Putting you in a kind of post-Soviet unipolar world of American capitalism. So you were born in that kind of unipolar world, which has now given way to kind of multipolar world, right? Where America versus China versus Russia, which is no longer the Soviet Russia, right? This Russia is under the capitalist autocracy of Vladimir Putin. So understanding Marxism is key to understanding 20th century, right? Secondly, it deeply influenced literature all over the world. It had a profound influence, and you can even look at the whole progressive movement in Hindi. For example, starting with Prem Chand, and then you have Mulk Raj Anand and others, Kaifi Azmi, many others were part of Ismat Chugtai, Strangely Manto, and others were deeply influenced. So whenever you hear word progressive, it has the influence of Marxism, right? Ismat Chugtai and others. So Marxism affected literature all over the world, including literatures of Gujarat, Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, Bengali, of course, right? Bengal is the only elected, was the only elected communist governed state in the whole world till I think 2011. So along with Kerala later on, right? So these two, so almost 40 years, not page number right now. I'm giving you the broader historical context of Marxism, right, Salori? I'm not going to follow the page numbers. If you want to see, okay, page number, we'll cut it down to page number 527 onwards. So this is not mentioned in Habib. I'm just trying to situate this idea in the context of our own life. And if you remember, we started out our discussion on literary criticism and theory 1 year ago with an idea of asking questions about our modernity, right? Our own context in which we find as Indians, and how the issues that we face today, right? So how can history help us to understand the present? That was one of the ideas with which we started out discussing Plato. And I said that the whole history of Western modernity is critical for us, given the fact that it has deeply influenced Indian modernities, right, in our languages. Given that, we are looking at the whole history of Western modernities from Plato onwards. And now we have reached a critical point with Marx, right? So in a way, we are trying to understand our own present, and in a way, we are trying to understand ourselves, own selves. So that is the broader context in which literary criticism becomes an interesting topic, right? So when you hear, say, for example, on social media, people fighting over things like you're leftist or you're communist or whatever, then what does it even mean is something that we should understand, right? Have you ever heard this kind of words being thrown about? You are a leftist or rightist or, yeah, communist.
Yes, sir. A
You
lot.
heard this kind of, you hear them a lot, right? So
Yes, sir.
that's part of your all the time. So let us look at where this whole idea comes from, right? And what does it even mean, right? And in MSU campus, right, you hear about it all the time, right? Left and the right wing and left wing. मुझे ये कभी भी समझ में नहीं आया विंग्स आते कहाँ से है कौवा के विंग्स होते हैं विंग और राइट विंग लेफ्ट विंग and one tribal says that left and the right are the wings of the same bird, right? So what is that same bird that we need to look at? And one of the most important philosopher of the left is obviously Karl Marx, right? And being deeply influenced by Hegel, he reinterprets Hegel very much like Plotinus reinterprets Plato, and Sir Philip Sidney reinterprets the classical canon, right? Or the way Samuel Johnson and Dryden reinterprets the idea of mimesis to solve the contemporary issues, right? Their own projects and agendas. In same way, if you go back to Hegel, then I don't know how many of you remember that master-servant dialectic, dialectica master-servant metaphor. Does anyone remember that? Yeah, Saloni. So what do you remember? Self-consciousness, right, as dependent on the consciousness of the other. So somebody has to know you, for you to know yourself, right? You can become student when only you are in the presence of a non-student, right? So master-servant metaphor is used to bring out the conflict and violence and politics that is part of dialectic, right? So consciousness, self-consciousness in its first stage, yes, Saloni, master can be called master only when the servant calls him master, right? And servant can be servant only when the master calls him master. So male can be male when there is non-male to call him male, right? Very interestingly, it reminded me of a Marathi poem by Tukaram. I'm sorry, Narsi Mehta. You heard of Narsi Mehta? And Narsi Mehta by no stretch of imagination read Hegel, but he's a 15th century Gujarati poet, right? Whose poem Vaishnava Janto Tene Kahiye was popularized by Gandhi. But Narsi Mehta says that in order for you to be real, by you he means God, right, Krishna, you have to accept that I am real, right? It is when my reality is established, only then your reality gets established. That's what he tells Krishna, right, the God. So God becomes real only in the presence of devotee. So it is devotee that affirms presence of God. So if there is no devotee, there is no God, right? So that's a kind of dialectical understanding that seems to be part of bhakti as well, but that is a very different thing. But master-servant dialectic emphasizes that self-consciousness in its second stage is a violent stage. The first stage is that of immediacy, immediate self-consciousness when you are born. The next is when you are in the presence of not you, that you start defining yourself, right? And this consciousness of you and not you is what Hegel calls desire in the second stage, where you negate the first stage. And this desire is conflictual. Means on one hand, you have to negate what is in front of you, right? As non-you has to be negated and destroyed, converted into you. But at the same time, you cannot be you, because if you destroy the other, you can't be you. So you have to destroy the other, and yet you should, you have not to destroy the other. So that is a kind of very violent stage of conflict, where one person tries to transcend one's life, risks one's life, you know, and other person gets scared and submits, right? And that moment one turns into master. Yes. And the other turns into, but what is not you may be the other person as well, Saloni, not necessarily nature, but nature, yes, but not only nature, right? So person, the consciousness which submits is called a slave or bondsman, while the consciousness which has taken risk, it has risked its life, becomes the master, right? So this dialectic has to be sublated, this opposition. You have to find common grounds and find a higher form of unity, right? And thus you can reach the absolute. So this dialectic, which is at heart of self-realization, is also the driver of the history, according to Hegel. And history also is a story of the thesis and antithesis and synthesis in the third state. So it's a linear progress of rationality, of freedom, so that ultimate telos of dialectic, or ultimate end of history, is absolute freedom, right? This is what we discussed in Hegel. याद है आपको सब ये, या भूल गए? याद आ रहा है किसी को ये सब? Who remembers these conversations? Yeah. So history is a linear process of consciousness as negating its earlier phases, right? So the first phase of immediate self-consciousness is negated in the presence of the other, and then self and other have to find a higher unity. They have to be sublated without their differences going away, right? So what is at center of Hegel's law of history is self-consciousness, and its ultimate output of history is absolute freedom and absolute self-consciousness, where self and other both are transcended into a higher unity, sublated into higher unity, right? What Marx does is he takes it as and turns it completely on its head, right? And he says that self-consciousness or consciousness is not the primary motor of history. The primary motor of history is material relationships. And by material relationships, you mean the relationship, say, for example, when people were nomadic and hunters and gatherers, their relationship was with food and hunting operations and weapons, and then they used to form groups so that they can hunt successfully. Then when they discovered agriculture, it was agricultural revolution, right? So all these revolutions in tools, revolutions in lifestyles are brought about through material changes in human life. So when human beings were hunters and gatherers, their weapons were what should I say, determinant factors of how successful they were. Their physical strength, their tools, and their cleverness, right? Because only then they can hunt and eat. So when the discovery of agriculture happened, the material conditions of man changed, right? Human beings settled down in, what should I say, near the fertile areas, geographical areas, usually around rivers, right? So this fertile soil that you find near the river is the material basis of the new life, the agricultural life. And instead of nomadic hunting gathering lifestyle, you had a sedentary lifestyle. And with agriculture, it happened that man discovered the secret of surplus. That means you can have more crop than you actually need to feed yourself, right? And this surplus agriculture can be exchanged through barter or whatever, right? So if you have extra corn, then you can exchange it for maybe a goat or a cattle or some renovation for your hut or whatever, right? So man discovered this surplus as one of the important, so that became a basis of new life. And then man wanted to increase that surplus to increase your, what should I say, better quality of life, right? So there was something called division of labor, that one man, instead of tilling the field and harvesting and doing all such things, found people to work for him, right? And this division of labor created possibility of preparing high surplus agriculture. And so people could get rich, right? So what Marx means by material relations or material means or material contexts are these things. Material transformation of life. Like when material context changes, then human life changes. So he argues that what drives history are these material factors, right? Where you find good stone that can be used for hunting, where you find alluvial soil near rivers which can help you have crops. When you divide labor, you get surplus of agriculture and so on. When you discover machines, right, there is another transformation in material basis of human society. So human society and human consciousness are based upon these material factors is the primary argument that Marx is forwarding. And he says that the primary driver of history is not idealist dialectic of Hegel, but dialectical materialism, right? So Marxism is also known as dialectical materialism. That is the term that Marx and Engels and others preferred over the term Marxism, right? So the basis is that the material conditions determine the social structures, determine the consciousness and the products of that consciousness. If you're living in a kind of land that produces a particular kind of crop, then your food will consist of that crop. If you are living in desert, then what will desert give you? That will determine your food and culture and habits. So material basis and relations determine social structures and the culture itself. Culture itself is determined by even social beliefs. Religions are in ultimate analysis, that's what Engels says, are derived or based upon material means of production, like the land, like the factory, right? Or the weapons you use to hunt animals and so on. These are the material So that is the foundation theory here of Marxism. So the material basis of the economic and material basis of society is called the base, and the beliefs, ideas, your cultural values, habits, your outlook to life is determined by social structure, right? So base and superstructure is one of the underlying core assumptions of Marxism. Right? So far with me, any doubts about what I have said?
Sir, can you repeat the base and superstructure thing?
Base, yeah, base is like, say, for example, if you live in desert, then your lifestyle, your outlook, your food, your clothing, your religion will be affected by the material environment in which you live. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Right. So this material basis, economic basis, right? So people living in fertile regions will have a different outlook and religion and culture. People living in difficult stony region would have a different kind of outlook. So culture and consciousness are determined by material base. So these material factors, environment and relationship is called the base. And superstructure is the societal organization, everything, religion, culture, literature, arts, so on and so forth, sciences, politics, and so on and so forth, right? So that is a core idea between base and superstructure. And he would argue that human history, right, is dialectical. That means it's based on negations and contradictions. So contradiction and negation in Hegel have a positive dimension, right? So negation or refutation or rejection of one idea is seen as a positive thing in the motor of history, right? It's seen as progress, right? So negation, contradiction of the earlier phase, right? And that leading to the next phase of history is dialectical, but it is materialistic. Yeah, Saloni, go ahead.
Sir, I could not understand this. Could you please explain what you meant by dialectical materialism, which is
You
another
know
term?
dialectic of Hegel, right?
Yes.
And it was dialectical idealism. He's talking of self-consciousness as the primary motor of history, right? Self-consciousness or pure absolute consciousness through dialectic, right? Negation of earlier stages.
Yes.
Thesis ka negation, antithesis, and then synthesis. So, but of what? Human consciousness. So for Hegel, human consciousness is the base of history. But for Marx, human consciousness is the superstructure. Base is the material means of production, material relation and material environment in which human being is situated, which is a material relation, right? Because if you are living near river, then the soil is far more fertile, so you can have better crop than a person living in a desert or in a rocky place. Yeah, so that is a relation. So these material relations are primary. Those, and so history is a history of, for him, class conflict. So society, according to Marx, is divided in people who own most of these means of production, people who own those weapons for hunting, right? And people who own the land, or people who own those factories. So ownership of property and means of production is in the hands of few people, right? Others are working on it. They are the workers. So there is always a conflict between the people who own the means of productions or private property versus people who work on them. So he uses the term bourgeoisie to indicate people who have private property and own means of production, right? That is the upper class, the rich class. And people who are workers, right, are called proletariats. Like what needed people? Payal, I couldn't get your question. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, like I want to say, people would need in our life needed to
Means needed means what? What needed?
basic things like you say that economical and cultural things.
So, what needed people? मुझे ये question समझ में नहीं आया तुम्हारा. You can explain in Hindi if you are comfortable with that.
Not sure, but I will. And
Yeah.
class.
Okay. So you can take time and try to formulate what exactly you want to know, right? Jelta, yes,
Okay.
our cultures, thoughts, environments are affected. He is putting it mildly. They are determined by material aspects of our life.
So he's
Right?
considering everything that affects our culture into material aspect.
Yeah. So material aspects would be your tools, your land, your environment, right? It would also include your body. It would also include a kind of trees that you have around you, right? All these are the material environment, material relationship you have with environment. That is the base of culture and thoughts. ऐसे वो कह रहा है. Saloni, yes, because we were largely focusing on idealism, right? Right from Plato to Hegel, हम idealism से बात कर रहे हैं. But with Marx, he is the first important philosopher of materialism, right? And it's a materialist view of society and culture that he is offering. Yeah, Mansi, question. Material in literal sense, yes, Delta. Mansi, go ahead.
So the superstructure is determined by the base.
Yeah.
So do people like these people who own the private property or the ones who work on the private property, do they become part of the superstructure?
Yes, the entire human society is part of superstructure, right? And base is the relationships with material things, tools, land, house that you live in, or whatever. Technology today, that is the material dimension of it. Yeah, kiska question? Saloni, yeah, go ahead.
Sir, am I right when I say that earlier the term bourgeoisie included the middle class people, and now Marx changed it to this upper class people, the people who have private property and means of production?
Not exactly. French term for the middle class, especially during industrialized period, was bourgeoisie. Right? It's not that Marx is giving it a different meaning. He means the same section. Who own, and middle class owns the means of production or private property. You own a small shop, and they are called petty bourgeoisie. यानी पान का ठेला है उसके पास, right? या टेम्पो है. So these are small owners of small property, right?
So then would they be called upper class people?
Pardon?
So then would they be called upper class people?
Yes. As different from people who did not own property, like peasants, like workers in factories that Blake seems to be so concerned about, children, sweepers, right? Women in industries. They did not own that factory. They were just working on that factory, and they worked on that because of division of labor, right? They didn't own that factory, and we'll talk about that at length. But
Sir,
owner class and worker class, ऐसे मान लो ना?
okay,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So in order to understand Marx, we will have to wrap our heads around the terms like capitalism, communism, and all, right?
Yes.
So would
So
you
I'm coming to
suggest?
that.
Okay, because this was something that I had kept in pending for long, and now I'll have to do it.
Yes. So let us understand who is a capitalist, right? Capitalist is a person, but capitalism is a system, and this system works on profit, right? Remember agricultural surplus कैसे produce हुआ पहले? One person used to till land and generate some food that was enough for him or her to eat. खुद का खाना वो कर सकता था. But he started employing other people on his farm, and the production, there were two people, so production increased, right? And because production increased, he had greater surplus of agriculture. So more workers, so division of labor results in surplus production, right? And surplus production results in profit. Does that make any sense? So capitalism is a system that works on investing to get greater profits, greater returns. And there are three or four main types of capitalism. The earliest is the feudal capitalism, right, which was agricultural based. Peasants काम करते थे और उसका सरप्लस ड्यूक को मिलता था, फिर ड्यूक उसमें उसका हिस्सा किंग को देता था, right? And he used to also fight for the king. That was the feudal capitalism. Then you had mercantile capitalism, where like East India Company, आप कहाँ से जाके spices ले आते हो, silk ले आते हो, opium ले आते हो, whatever. So that is called mercantile capitalism, where the investment was so the capitalist is a person who risks, right, to earn the profit. And this whole risk profit driven system is called capitalism. Capital यानी wealth, जिससे आप ज्यादा wealth कर सकते हो. यानी आप फैक्ट्री डालते हो तो वो कैपिटल हुआ आपका in commercial terms. So that produces objects that you are manufacturing, right? So one of the important works by Marx is Capital. Das Capital, right? Stock market is financial. Yeah, that is also a form of capitalism, financial and stock market capitalism. These are the newer corporate capitalism is slightly different. It goes back to mercantilism, but then it's also different, where nobody actually owns the factory. Reliance Industries is not really owned by companies, right? They are the people who have maximum shares in it. If you have one share in Reliance, then you are also one of the owners in that corporate. So 3 or 4 type capitalism बहुत type के होते हैं. But the basic idea is investment, risk, profit. That is how it is done, and it has division of labor at its heart, right? And one more thing that is crucial to capitalism is that you own a small farm and you produce something that is sufficient only for you. When you employ other person, you pay him something, right, which is part of your investment. But the surplus that you generate और उसमें से जो profit मिलता है, उसके comparison में उसे 50% हिस्सा नहीं मिलता. पहले एक आदमी काम कर रहा है फील्ड पे और वो 10 किलो गेहूं पकाता है, राइट? फिर दूसरा आदमी उसे वो काम पे रखता है, वो दोनों मिलके 25 या 20 किलो गेहूं पकाते हैं, राइट? and he sells it in the market. But the money that he gets, right, he does not give 50% to that man. Right? He gives 10%, 5% of that money. So, but that man has worked 50%. His labor is 50%, but उसकी earning कितनी है? 10%. तो वो 40% जो है ना difference, वो profit है. So capitalism is inherently based on exploitation. Does that make any sense to you? Inherently. Anything that you have to say about what capitalism is? So capitalism works on exploitation of labor because the wages that your worker get are fairly small compared to the amount of labor they have put in. Right? So all of you, when you go to work tomorrow after your BA or after your MA, you will find that you may get salary of 25,000 somewhere, but the work that you are doing, the labor that you are putting it is of 1 lakh rupees. And that is how capitalism works. Yeah, who had a question?
Sir, so then the reason people do such labor is because they think that this is better than no labor, like unemployment.
Yeah, because they don't own anything.
Okay.
Right?
Oh.
So marriage as an institution also evolved from capitalism, right? So that the property remains in the family. Does that mean Marx opposed capitalism? Now, this is very interesting question. There is an ambivalent, right? Because from Hegelian paradigm, capitalism is an advanced stage compared to feudalism. यानी capitalism inherently progressive है compared to feudalism. But the next stage of Hegelian dialectic will be a state where there is no private property. That is the communist state, where all the means of production are owned by everybody equally. So factory is as much owned by the worker as by the whoever owned it first. So all entire society owns property and means of production. That is called the communist state, where there is no class distinction between the capitalist class and the worker class. All people are both workers and capitalists. That is the communist society, and Marx prophesies that capitalism will collapse because of internal contradictions within capitalism, and it will give rise to communist state. That is his prophecy, and it can be done through revolution or it can be done through slow change. And Russians tried their hand first, and through revolution they overthrew czars and they established the Soviet state in 1970. Who gave this prophecy? Marx gave this prophecy. और उसका बेसिस क्या था? हेगल, जो कह रहा है कि थीसिस होगा एंटीथीसिस है, तो एंटीथीसिस का एंटीथीसिस क्या होगा? सिंथेसिस, राइट? सो कैपिटलिज्म का एंटीथीसिस क्या है? कम्युनिज्म, वर्कर्स मूवमेंट. So workers movement will result in a revolution which will result in classless society. Does capitalism limit within class? No, class division is the basis of capitalism. अगर workers नहीं होंगे तो आपको profit कैसा मिलेगा? So it's not that workers are out of capitalist system. They are integral to capitalism. Their exploitation is the base of capitalism.
Sir, actually I meant like if suppose a merchant is hiring a worker or something, so the merchant will be below some other higher power than him, right? So is he being also exploited, or will he also come under capitalism in a way,
Yes,
or is it?
because he's exploiting people under him and people above him are exploiting him. Uh, but
So
then he
that,
earns more than the person below him.
yeah, that is right.
So
So
that
is it only for the labor class people? Capitalism just does it only go for the lower class people?
yeah, workers. See, they are considered lower class. They don't have time to read your Shakespeare because whole day they will be working on factories or farms. So they would be looked down upon as inferior. And they are poor, right? So history is driven by class conflict. So instead of idealistic dialectic of Hegel, the driver of history is material dialectic materialism. And capitalism is an advanced stage over feudalism, but it is regressive compared to communism. So it's a linear teleology of Hegel, so that at the end of this dialectical materialism, you will have absolute freedom in the form of communist state. So you can see the adoption of Hegelian dialectic here, right? He turns it on its head, saying that consciousness is secondary or derived, material basis is primary. So people who own that material base are powerful people, upper class. जिसके पास सबसे ज्यादा जमीन है वो जमींदार is a more powerful person. Right. So communism involves classless society. And that was the model on which Soviet Union started off. By heavy industrialism, they wanted to bring in classless society. मगर कुछ ऐसा हुआ नहीं. Saloni has a question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go
This
ahead.
might be a very silly question to ask, but I'll still
Feel
ask
free
it.
to ask as many silly questions as you want.
Yes, because I'm very bad at this side of whatever this is, philosophical criticism. Jelta asked that, let's say the owner of a shop exploits the workers of that shop. So then who exploits the owner of that shop?
Not always necessary, na? Not always necessary. Unless that shop is owned by something. If it is a franchisee, as they call it, then
Yeah. But if
so it's a different.
if it is owned by him, then nobody exploits him, right?
Yeah, he exploits other capitalist है वो.
Yes. Okay. Got it.
जैसे कि आपके घर पे आप काम वाली रखते हो, right? और उसके wages are usually disproportional to amount of labor that if you were to do the same work, how much would you charge, right? And what do you actually give to your maid? So it's always more labor, less wages. That is the basis of capitalism. Yeah. Digvijay is asking how is idea of marriage a product of capitalism? And Engels says this, right? And he points out, Frederick Engels, that the family as an institution, right, has a patriarch who owns the property. Now this property has to has to stay within his family, right? It cannot go outside. So in order to protect family property, marriage as an institution came up because that gave legality to the offspring of that child. So the child born from that relation with that woman would be the inheritor of property. Right? Is that clear, Digvijay?
Sir, so like like you said that feudalism is like the first stage of capitalism in some sense. So this notion of marriage, you are talking it in terms of legality, right? That it is,
Legality, yes.
yeah, legally it
But
is.
is it marriage a legal, primarily a legal institution?
Yes, but in the sense that uh, we have the institution of marriage before this idea
No,
of
no.
capital.
It comes with the idea of private property. It goes way down when. So, marriage came into existence when you needed legitimacy of transfer of property, right? Who will you transfer the property to legitimately? So that legitimacy कैसे तय करोगे? तो that's what whole Mahabharata is about. महाभारत की स्टोरी मैंने कह दी एक लाइन में आपको. Who will rule over Hastinapur? Right?
Okay.
And because the true heir has decided that he will never get married, Bhishma. So it goes to Pandu and Dhritarashtra. But Pandu dies. Dhritarashtra becomes the king. So he's not the lead. So who will inherit Hastinapur? Because Pandavas are not technically Pandu's sons, right?
Yes.
So the question of legitimacy and ownership of property and wealth is critical to the institution of marriage.
Okay. So that even that society of the Mahabharata is a capitalistic society in let's say.
Yeah. Some sort of capitalism, primitive capitalism existed. But we can say so. It is monarchic or feudal monarchies जैसा लग रहा है वो.
Yes. But so the notion of inheritance and private property is central here, right? When we try to distinguish capitalism and wealth. So even when we talk about Mahabharata, this notion of private property, the kingdom being a property or some palace being your property. So this property is central here.
No, very interesting question, because what we understand as private property is in relation to state today. You can have private property, but in the time of Mahabharata, you cannot have private property because सब जो जमीन है ना वो राजा की होती है, सब प्रॉपर्टी राजा की होती है, तुम्हारी प्रॉपर्टी कुछ नहीं होती. So private property is a product of post-monarchic state. Modern state जब आता है ना तब private property का issue आता है. Right? So ownership of wealth and legitimacy, all these questions go back to the time of kingship and monarchy and feudalism. But the idea of public property, private property, yani tumhari or meri, comes into existence with modern state in Europe, modern bourgeois state in Europe. That is the foundation of modern capitalism. Right? So when you own your house, it's a capital. You can loan it out, right? You can rent it out.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. And next question is, would capitalism ever end? Would people stop exploiting class? I don't think so. मुझे तो नहीं दिख रहा है. आपको दिख रहा है ऐसा कुछ?
No, sir, I don't have enough knowledge on it. But is there any
knowledge है? नहीं knowledge है.
दिख रहा है.
आसपास देखो ना, ऐसा लग रहा है कभी खत्म हो गया.
Yeah, no, it won't. But then after Marx, has any other theory like come up or something, an alternative?
An alternative to exploitation?
Yes.
Gandhi. Yeah. Gandhi says that all rich owners of private are actually trustees of, not owners of wealth, but trustees, and it's their sacred duty, religious duty, to behave in that manner rather than as capitalist exploiting workers. So this idea of trusteeship is what Gandhi advances. And unlike Marx, who talks about violent revolutions, Gandhi would insist upon non-violence as fundamental to the process of transformation. What is difference between right wing and left wing? in terms of capitalism and communism or capitalism and socialism, left wing would be something that is socialist or Marxist. Socialism or Marxism, they are used interchangeably, but socialist may not be a communist like Nehru or G.B. Shaw, Bernard Shaw, right? They are socialists. They believe that social transformation is through democratic, peaceful, non-violent process, right? They don't support workers' capture of power and establishment of proletariat dictatorship. That is the difference between socialism and communism. And socialism is a kind of ambivalent word. Even Hitler called his party Socialist National Socialist Party, right? But basically, in terms of economy, if you are in favor of planned economy, then you are left wing, centralized, owned by the state, owned by. So, what kind of economy we had till 1990, where all the enterprise was controlled by the government, would be socialist idea. That would be left, right? Right wing would be in favor of free market capitalism or liberalism. सो सोवियत और चाइना की तरफ आप जाते हो तो लेफ्ट होते हो, अमेरिका की तरफ जाते हो तो आप राइट होते हो. जय.
Yes, sir. Understood.
Right, and it is connected to this Whig and Tory business, right? Because left would be going towards Labour Party, would go towards socialist parties. So that would be Whig. Tories, conservatives would be in favor of landlords and rich people. So they would be right. So ideologically speaking, right is conservative, always working in favor of the small, rich sections. Left is speaking on behalf of the poor. ऐसे roughly कह सकते हो. ऐसे कोई hard and fast नहीं है definition, but roughly on orientation of economics and political economy. And left wing can have lot of Christian left wing जैसे भी हो सकता है, जैसे जॉन रस्किन. गांधीयन लेफ्ट विंग भी हो सकता है, अम्बेडकराइट लेफ्ट विंग भी हो सकता है. Where basically what you are saying is that there should be justice for all, right? There should be no discrimination, justice. That is what left would insist upon. That those are the ideals. Now, when I say ideals, reality ऐसे लेना देना नहीं होता बहुत बड़ा ideals. So India, which was left wing, turned right wing in the 90s with Manmohan Singh.
So
Soviet Union had a private state-owned economy. पूरे industries, private property सभी owned by the state, and state belongs to all people, proletariat. Yeah, Saloni, go ahead.
you said left wing are the people in favor of planned economy by the central government, right?
Centralized planned economy. And
Yes, and then you said that those are also the people who want justice for all. But
yeah,
no.
that's a
Today-
contradiction.
Oh, okay.
Isn't that true?
Yeah, today when we see all the stories on Instagram, it's all different.
No,
No?
I didn't get your last point.
So today when we see this leftist, rightist thing on Instagram, especially, I see it there only. So then one side you're saying they are in the favor of planned centralized economy.
एक्चुअली 1990 के बाद मुझे लेफ्ट और राइट में कुछ फर्क ही समझ में नहीं आता, क्योंकि लेफ्ट विंग जो था ना पहले वो ट्रेड यूनियन मूवमेंट के साथ जुड़ा था, इंडस्ट्रियलाइज्ड वर्कर्स ट्रेड यूनियन मूवमेंट्स, राइट? Because Marx himself was in favor of trade union movement. Now after 90s the economy turned into financial and service sector, financial capitalism, corporate capitalism, which did not have trade unions as the nucleus of politics, left-wing politics. So actually left and right सिर्फ opinion domain में रह गए. There is no political base for left in the world today. I hope you get what I'm trying to say. After 1990, how will you have the primary nucleus of left-wing politics is trade union movement. Now there are no trade unions left. And the economy is kind of service sector, right? Where all this class conflict or yes, a trade union does not make any sense. रिक्शा वालों की यूनियन होती है, सलून हेयर कटर की एसोसिएशन होती है, but that is not trade union. They own those things, right? They are not workers. Though they work, they own those properties. So left and right after 90s for me has almost become redundant in terms of politics. How will you do politics? And that's why you can see after 90s, left in India has gone down the hill. There is Kerala में something like left बचा है कुछ. तो क्या है मुझे पता नहीं, पर ऐसा है लग रहा है. वो कहते हैं जैसे चाइना में अभी पड़ा है लेफ्ट पर जैक मा को फाइन करना, ये लेफ्ट हो गया उनके लिए. Yeah, so what's the question?
So then, according to today, like today's times, then how would we define leftist and rightist? Like these people are pointing fingers at each other. So then, how are they defined?
So suppose you believe in social justice, let's say. That's a tricky word. So people who are oppressed or who are marginalized, उनके लिए justice की अगर आप बात करते हो तो वो left होगा. But that is also very tricky because anybody can do that, right? Right वाले भी ये कर सकते हैं, उसमें क्या बड़ी बात. Social justice for the oppressed and the marginalized. If you speak on behalf of Dalits or poor migrants or what, LGBTQ, then you are supposed to be on left. But then anybody can speak for those people, not just left. So I don't see any point in using left and right as a paradigm for politics any longer.